In 1890, in the shadowy hills of a forgotten land, Edmund Blackwood founded Asylum Blackwood. There were not enough walls to contain the madness he was about to unleash. Blackwood, a brilliant doctor but tormented by the loss of his wife Eleanor, became obsessed with death. He believed he could transcend the boundaries of life and death, and to do so, he began treating his patients as lab rats, forcing them to undergo experiments that went beyond known science. His goal? To bring his wife back or at least understand what happens after death. But what he found, instead of answers, was something far more terrifying. At first, Asylum Blackwood seemed like just a place of seclusion, where society's outcasts were kept away from the world's eyes. But soon, the walls of the place began to reflect something far darker. Over time, the patients began to disappear, not physically, but in a much more disturbing way. They turned into shadows, echoes of what they once were. And Blackwood watched all of this with a smile that seemed more of triumph than despair. In 1900, after a decade immersed in his dubious practices, Blackwood vanished. Asylum Blackwood was closed and forgotten for a decade. But the evil he had awakened never stopped haunting the place. In 1910, the asylum was reopened by the Sisters of Charity, transformed into an orphanage. However, the place was no longer a refuge for children. The sisters built a church beside it and soon began performing rituals, believing that the cure for disturbed minds came through prayers, exorcisms, and aggressive spiritual practices. But instead of healing, what spread there was a fog of paranoia. Exorcisms, rituals, purification, nothing seemed real anymore. The walls were saturated with despair, and the children found themselves lost, struggling to distinguish between what was real and what their minds had distorted. In 1914, World War I arrived, and with it, Asylum Blackwood was transformed once again. No longer an orphanage, but a war hospital. The doctors began using questionable methods. The mental suffering of soldiers became a field for psychological experiments. Visionaries, as they were called, implemented brutal and unconventional techniques, lobotomies, electroshock therapy, experimental treatments with unknown substances. Desperate attempts to heal the wounds of the mind, but what happened was the amplification of chaos. Each treatment seemed to plunge the patients into an even more distorted reality. The line between what was human and what was no longer began to dissolve. During the height of World War I, in 1917, a tunnel was built. It was not only used to bury the dead or transport the desperate. The tunnel connected to a distant cemetery, where bodies were buried without names, only numbers. The patients of the asylum were no longer identified. They were reduced to symbols. Discarded, just like that. In the end, everyone there was just a number, no longer a person. In 1939, World War II brought a new wave of suffering. The asylum was no longer just a war hospital, but a place where those who had gone mad from the horrors of battle were brought. The cures applied to soldiers were now used on civilians as well. The place became a laboratory, where visionary doctors tried to control the human mind using every conceivable method. The more they tried to heal, the more they distorted what was left of their patients' humanity. Some said the place was beyond healing, that the people there were beyond saving. Finally, in 1970, Asylum Blackwood was permanently closed. What remained were the decaying walls, the echoes of screams, and the shadow of what it once was. The place stayed silent, waiting. And now, decades later, new documents and diaries began to be discovered, papers and notes from patients, doctors, and staff, all filled with twisted stories of experiments that should never have been carried out. But after all, what really happened there? What really lies at the bottom of Asylum Blackwood? After all, what hides between the pages of a diary may be more than mere words. As the records of Edmund Blackwood and the documents from Asylum Blackwood become visible, the line between sanity and madness begins to disappear. Subscribe and follow each revelation, because not everything that seems real actually is.